chains and that you're going to have people fighting to get out of that. Instead, you're going to have people who are presented with certain circumstances. You may be put in a crisis situation by others. So, I mean, there are definitely going to be people involved, but it's not the kind of violent overthrow, I think, that a lot of people think of when they hear masters and slaves.
Yeah, I'm not going to rule that out.
Well, how does Crowley see it a little differently than Hegel?
Well, Hegel saw the master-slave dichotomy sort of forcing itself into a resolution, and ultimately he thought that human beings would pass beyond Christianity by making the Christian ideal of equality and ending the tension between various classes and struggles in one gigantic state, a total state, in which all of these crises would become resolved because everyone would be valued and everyone's work and effort would be considered important within the context of this absolutely total state. And he thought that Christianity ultimately fulfilled itself in what, I think we would look at as some sort of totalitarian society. And I don't know if Crowley really believed that. I know Nietzsche certainly was skeptical about it, and I think instead that they saw a sort of constant battle between, the various classes just going on forever, and that tension, was just part of life. Now, we also have to be careful about what point in Crowley's life would he be observing this. And I think, one of the things about Magic Without Tears that makes it difficult for people is that it was written at the end of his life, and he contradicts some of the things that he said earlier on. And I think at the, early 1900s, around 1918, 1917, 1919, we see Crowley thinking that the OTO is going to be a system that's going to take over the United States, that it's going to become a very strong institutional structure, or even a countercultural institution, or he says it in some letters that he thinks that it's going to catch on throughout the United States, and people in positions of secular power are going to see that it's the system that's going to work. And then much time goes by, and in the 40s he was very skeptical about group activities, and you can see that skepticism very strongly expressed in Magic Without Tears. So at one point, I think it might not be off base to say that Crowley thought that the OTO was a version of Hegel's total system, and it certainly somewhat looks like that. And then, in the 40s, he's basically saying, no, Thelema is really about the individual. The group, the sect, the clan doesn't count for anything. He says the individual is the sole autarch. And again, this is one of the things in Magic Without Tears that people really have a problem with. I don't really see the community being as supportive of the totality of the individual as it used to be, because I think that it's seen that when you say that, you can't protect yourself from criticism. You can't. Only very strong people are really going to react positively to that sort of metaphysical imperative. So, I think it bears more study. I think it's fascinating, because I don't really think Crowley ever wanted a total resolution the way Hegel did. I think in the 40s he was content to say, hey, there's going to be certain people who will only band together when there are crises that force them to, and the rest of the time they're not going to want to work together, and they're going to be skeptical of group activity. And that's, I think, very, very interesting. Hegel also pointed out that there's always going to be conflict between the family and the state. The family loves you for what you are, regardless of what you do. The state only values your activity. So he saw in the pagan state, the pre-Christian pagan state, a conflict between familial obligations and roles, and the roles of the society. That you were either true to your family and betrayed the state, or you were going to be true to the state and betray your family. And he thought that was the source of the pagan tragic worldview. Whether that can ever be resolved in an integrated hierarchical system with slaves and masters within the Thelema context, I don't know. And I think that at one point Crowley sort of conceived of it as an organic state where that kind of hierarchy could exist, and at other times I think he despaired of group workings only because he saw that people would start to, fall prey to the mass mind and the conformity demands of the group.
Well, I think he also looked at it as the distraction. I mean, when he was disparaging the groups, he's like, people just get together, and I think he just criticized each other's hats.
Yeah, it's not, and then the work suffers because of that. And so he was much more in Magic Without Tears. You see him telling people, like, you only get together when you absolutely have to, and if you don't have to, you don't need to. But we see this in context because he was dealing with the problems at Agape Lodge and the problems that he was having with people in America and in various places with their negative group dynamics going on. And people can read the Red Flames, which discuss that period to get a better idea of what sort of chaos and problems were going on in that community.
Well, and in some ways, we still have a bunch of those kind of problems happening today.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the conflict in the OTO, is how does a group of Thelemites work together? And many people say things like, well, trying to get Thelemites to work together is like trying to herd cats. We hear this all the time. And group projects and group work is often very difficult in the Thelemic community. I think it's difficult because I don't think people really understand what's involved with it, and they're confusing egalitarian and normative values with Thelemic values. But regardless, it's not something that's been resolved for us, and it's something that I think most people are putting off resolving for themselves, and usually they just give up.
Well, I think there's also the aspect of it that a lot of the group workings are not really goal-oriented. I mean, like, for instance, if they do a group ritual, it's more about doing the group ritual and having some kind of cohesiveness and fraternity and camaraderie in doing the ritual than actually achieving anything with the ritual itself.
Right, and part of the issue with that is that magical results are easy to disconfirm. I mean, they lend themselves to being undermined or questioned, and so often what you'll see is people who start out trying to do stuff with magic settle for the byproducts of those workings, which are exchange of affect within the group. And again, I mean, there's a movement towards making the group the most important thing, and the social instinct begins to take over rather than, what I think we were to look at, which is, the individual will. And, we've been talking a lot recently about how people are looking for this sort of group acceptance, and they're ready to sacrifice any sort of individuality or individual perspective in order to get to it, which I don't think is healthy, and I don't think is particularly Thelemic, but it is part of the process.
Well, where do you think, Hegel falls in with the, the kind of the edicts within the Book of the Law about, trample down the wretched and the weak, and all of this very martial dichotomy between the master and the slave?
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on Hegel, but I do think that we can ask ourselves whether or not Crowley really wanted to eliminate slaves entirely, or a purpose and a place for them within the society that he conceived as Thelemic. And on the one hand, I get the idea that people are unhappy with the idea of there being any slaves at all, and that in a perfect Thelemic society there would be no slaves. And I think this is somewhat foolish. It's like the people who think you can have perfect Jeffersonian democracy without a slave society. And I think that's foolish too, because it's failing to look at the historical determinants that created Jefferson and Jeffersonian ideals for democracy. He was sitting there in a plantation that was being run and worked on by slaves. And when I see, for example, conservative people arguing that we should return to this Jeffersonian thing, they don't talk about the historical determinants that created that, which I think is silly. But do we want to eliminate slavery entirely as Thelemites, or is Thelema coming to eliminate slavery and free everybody, or is Thelema there to free the people who can handle it, and that's really it? And that's the problem, because the egalitarian impulse coming from Christianity is that there should be no slaves at all, that everyone should be equal. And I don't really know if that's what Crowley is talking about or what he was really interested in. And I think, unfortunately, that's where people tend to disagree with him, and then the system begins to collapse as they remove one structure after another that he put in place in order to get back to their egalitarian ideals, the ones that they're comfortable with, the ones that they get from normative society.
So you're saying it's kind of hard to have or implement the Thelemic ideal unless you have this kind of class system of the dichotomy between those who are willful and those who are fearful.
Well, I think the difficulty that you're seeing over and over again with this is that people want a egalitarian society, and they think that that's the only just one. So if they really are committed to that, why are there ranks and degrees and a hierarchy within a group, say, like the OTL? And you see this tension develop, because on the one hand, everyone thinks Thelema is about equality, and on the other hand, the system is set up to be completely unequal. So how do they resolve that conflict and that tension? And there's hypocrisies that go on where, the people who are the most ferocious about equality issues are the ones who are, coveting these upper degrees, which once they get, they, are very happy to have. And so there really hasn't been any consensus within the community that equality is not something we should be all seeking, but the structure of their very community itself is one that's not equal. So I don't know how they're going to resolve that. And, is that the same thing as masters and slaves? Well, not entirely, because people can say, we're not trying to enslave the Minervals of the first degrees. But it definitely isn't an equal situation.
Right. So, whether it's a master or slave, it's definitely a hierarchy of some kind and basically anti-egalitarian.
Right. And that's the problem, because as long as people have this anti-egalitarian attitude going on, they'll never be happy with the OTO. And if they're not happy with the OTO in the way that it's structured and the designs that Crowley had for it, they won't commit to it. And if they won't commit to it, they won't donate money to it, they won't donate time to it, they won't take it seriously. It becomes a game or an exercise in pursuing the exchange of affect or, whatever, but it's not serious and it's not something that, people are going to take seriously enough to manifest. So this is this conflict that goes on. And the leaders of the group, I don't really think, have made up their minds either about this. On the one hand, they want the hierarchy, and on the other hand, they keep stepping away from it and saying, I don't really feel that we're leaders. I don't really feel that I'm not happy with these titles, whatever line they're trying to pull. So they want the best of both worlds, and they wind up with the worst of both and the best of neither. They seem authoritarian, and yet they can't really do anything with their authority. And they push equality, but they don't really have the benefit of it because they don't have a system that's set up to be equal.
Well, the other problem they have is they insist that, the members look up to the leaders and respect them and everything. But then if people feel that everyone's equal, they're not going to, or they'll just give it lip service. And even if the leaders are have an egalitarian mindset, then they're not going to really see themselves as that different from those of the lower degrees, and therefore they're not going to really kind of push on them or challenge them, which is why we kind of have this mush that exists today.
Right, and this is why I think going back and looking at writers like Hegel and like Nietzsche, who did see the necessity of unequal relations and did see the importance of a hierarchy, and did look at the world without the need to see it in this particular way is important. Nietzsche challenged Hegel's idea of what a fulfilled Christianity would be like by attacking the whole system of Christian morality to begin with. But at the same time, it's very difficult not to see a sort of Hegelian process going on now where the most Christian people are often the ones who, to me anyway, don't really believe in God, but are trying to manifest a perfectly equal total state here on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And, Oswald Spengler once said that Christianity was the grandmother of communism, or Bolshevism, and I can see what where he's coming from with that. The idea that everyone should be equal and there should be a huge state taking care of everyone that we all participate in seems to me like it really comes from Christianity. And if you don't believe that, if you're opposed to that sort of ultimate model, then you also have to look at the origins of your values and where they come from. And Crowley was very opposed to communism. He once said that Thelema's best advantage was that it was the only ideology that could go up against communism. in a post-communist world, we might laugh at that, but I still think it has a lot of value, a lot there to teach us.
Well, one of the things that we mentioned earlier that we really haven't explained is why Christianity